Hannah wasn't sure when it started to hurt more to stay than to imagine what it would be like to leave. She'd grown up hearing that family was everything, that a good daughter didn't talk back, and that respect was shown with obedience. Deep down, something inside her knew there was something twisted in that logic. But when everyone around you tells you that's normal, you end up believing the problem is you. For years, her role in the house was clear. Serve. Make coffee for her father. Make Caleb's bed, fold her mother's clothes, clean the bathroom even when she was sick. And she did it, convinced that one day someone would notice, that maybe she'd receive a thank you, a proud look, a small gesture of affection. But it never came. The day everything collapsed began like any other. Hannah was 17 and returning from school, her backpack weighing more than usual and a stabbing pain in her back. Upon entering the living room, she found Caleb's dirty clothes strewn across the floor once again. The maid hadn't shown up, and her mother was already waiting for her with that familiar look, the one that needed no words. But that day, Hannah didn't move. She just said, "He can wash it." And it was as if she'd insulted the entire family. Her mother frowned and called her father. They all sat in the living room as if it were an emergency meeting. They accused her of being disrespectful, ungrateful, of wanting to destroy family harmony. And then her father stood up. The slap came quickly. It hurt, but it wasn't the blow that hurt most. It was seeing that no one found it unacceptable. No one. There were no screams afterward, no slamming doors, no dramatic scenes. Hannah slowly went up to her room, carefully closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. Her cheeks were still burning, but what she felt most was a strange calm, as if something inside her had clicked. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just took a deep breath and looked around. Her desk, filled with used books, the lamp with the frayed cord that they never bought her again, the curtains she sewed herself. Everything spoke of neglect disguised as routine. She got up, took out her old notebook, and began to write. A list of tasks, of phrases, of silences. It was her way of not forgetting. That same night, while everyone was asleep, she quietly packed a few things. It wasn't an impulsive escape. It was something that had been brewing inside for some time, even if she didn't know. She packed 3 changes of clothes, her notebook, some savings she had secretly saved, and a worn photo of Amara, her best friend. She didn't leave a note. She just carefully placed the sheet of paper with her list on the dining room table. A cold but accurate summary of everything she had done for that house, without acknowledgement, without love. Then, she walked through the front door as gently as she had lived there all those years, without making a sound. But this time, she wouldn't be coming back. Amara welcomed her without questions. As soon as she opened the door, she hugged her tightly, as if she knew exactly what was going on without needing to explain. Amara's house was small, with walls covered in photos and the smell of homemade soup. But for Hannah, it was a completely different world. There, no one demanded anything of her. No one expected her to clean, to serve, to be quiet. Amara's mother, a woman with a soft voice and warm hands, made a bed for her on the couch and told her she could stay as long as she needed. That first night, Hannah slept soundly for the first time in years, without fear of being woken by screams, without guilt, just tiredness. The next day, when she opened her eyes, Hannah felt a mixture of relief and vertigo. She didn't have a concrete plan. She didn't know how long she could stay, but she also knew she couldn't go back, not after everything. With Amara's help, she began looking for ways to earn some money, selling homemade bread, in the town square, helping a neighbor with chores. Nothing glamorous, but enough to begin to sustain herself. Little by little, she began to rebuild what the Whitmore house had taken from her. Her voice, her worth, her right to exist without being of use to others. For the first few weeks, Hannah kept her disappearance completely silent. She didn't write, didn't call, or check her messages. Every vibration of her phone made her stomach clench, but she didn't answer. She was afraid, of course. Not of physical punishment, she'd already experienced that, but of the emotional blackmail, the guilt, the empty promises she knew would come. But they didn't come. Not a call from her mother, not a text from Caleb, just a brief, threatening email from her father saying, "When you calm down, come back. This family doesn't tolerate scandals." Hannah read those words over and over again, not with sadness, but with a kind of brutal confirmation. They didn't miss her. They just wanted her to continue, fulfilling her role. It was their silence that most drove her to move forward. There was no love to rescue, no bonds to restore. Only a structure she had sustained alone for years, now teetering without her presence. From there, she made a firm decision to document everything. She returned to her list and transformed it into a detailed archive. Every task she had done, every obligation imposed on her, every birthday she cooked for everyone and didn't receive a single congratulation. She had pages and pages of evidence, not to denounce, but to prevent her mind from one day minimizing what she experienced. Because that was the real risk, that over time, one forgets, or begins to justify. And Hannah wasn't going to forget. As the months passed, Hannah managed to rent a small studio thanks to the odd job she found, and the discreet help of Amara's mother, who treated her with a tenderness she had never felt in her own home. The place was tiny, a single room with a mattress on the floor, a plastic table, and a window that barely let in any light. But for her, it was freedom. For the first time, she could decide what to eat, what time to sleep, how to organize her things. No one yelled at her. No one made demands of her. There was only silence, and that silence was hers. In that modest space, she began to imagine herself as a whole person, not a household tool. One afternoon, while organizing some papers, she found her old box of memories. Inside was everything she had saved from the Whitmore's house, childhood drawings, unopened letters, a photo of her truly smiling at 9 years old. Seeing that image was hard. It was hard to recognize herself in that little girl. She wanted to hold her, protect her, explain to her that one day everything would change. But she didn't cry. She closed the box, put it under her bed, and promised herself she wouldn't live anchored to the past. From that moment on, every small step forward, getting a job interview, cooking something new, sleeping without troubles, was a form of reparation. A slow, silent, but profoundly real justice. As Hannah rebuilt her life from the ground up, indirect news from her family began to trickle in. A neighborhood acquaintance mentioned, almost unintentionally, that the Whitmore house no longer seemed the same, that her mother was more jittery, that Caleb was complaining about having to do his own laundry, that her father was more irritable than ever. Hannah wasn't pleased by this. She didn't feel vengeful, not even satisfied. She was simply confirming what she already sensed, that the system that had oppressed her so much was fragile, and that her role, invisible, silent, was the only thing keeping it going. She was gone, and everything was beginning to fall apart without her needing to do anything else. It was then that she decided to finish what she had started on that piece of paper she had left on the table before leaving. She gathered all her lists, memories, and small records, carefully arranged them in folders, and placed them inside a cardboard box. On the cover, she wrote, without embellishment or elaborate phrases, "Unpaid work." She wasn't planning on sending it yet, but knowing that it existed, that it was ready, gave her a different kind of peace. It wasn't about filing a complaint or collecting a debt. It was a declaration, a way of saying, I know what I did. I know my worth. That box was her truth, a summary of years of effort, of enforced silences, and of everything no one wanted to see. A few months later, Hannah received an unexpected letter. It wasn't from her family, but from school. A former teacher, who had always regarded her with a certain amount of silent admiration, was offering her a partial scholarship for a technical course in community management. Nothing luxurious, but enough to begin building a professional life outside the constraints imposed on her. Hannah hesitated for a few days. It was hard for her to imagine herself in a classroom without the pressure of rushing home to cook or clean. But she finally accepted. Each class was a challenge, not because of the content, but because of the simple fact of allowing herself to be there, occupying a space just for herself, without feeling guilty about prioritizing herself. While studying in the mornings and working in the afternoons, Hannah began to reconnect with herself in unexpected ways. She started writing again, this time not to-do lists or abuse inventories, but fragments of memories, loose ideas, dreams she hadn't allowed herself to have for years. One of those nights, as she reread her writing, she realized something that paralyzed her. For the first time in a long time, her past was no longer the only thing filling the pages. She was beginning to imagine a future, and not one of escape or survival, but one with real choices, with her own direction. That realization came not with tears or euphoria, only with a faint smile as she poured herself a hot tea in her small kitchen, in total silence. Over time, Hannah felt the time had come. She took the box she'd prepared months earlier and decided to send it by courier to her parents' house. She included no note, no warning, no explanation. Just the box itself, carefully sealed, as a silent testament to everything she'd given and endured. She didn't expect a response, and there wasn't one. But she did learn, from a mutual friend, that her father opened it and remained silent for minutes. That her mother read it without saying a word. That Caleb, upon seeing it, simply shrugged. That indifference, especially from her brother, was the most painful confirmation and also the most liberating. Because it was then that she understood that her worth didn't depend on their recognition of it. She had learned to see herself through different eyes. Shortly after that shipment, Hannah received an unexpected call. It was Amara, fighting back tears. Her mother, the woman who had taken her in with a generosity she would never forget, had suffered a stroke. Hannah went immediately to the hospital, without a second thought. Over the next few weeks, she took turns with Amara caring for her, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair, bringing food, holding the trembling hand that had once tenderly caressed hers. It was hard, but also eye-opening, because in that shared pain, she understood what true love was. Not the kind that demands, punishes, or manipulates, but the kind that gives without expecting anything in return. Sitting beside that cold white bed, Hannah felt like, at last, she had a real family. Not by blood, but by choice and mutual care. When Amara's mother was discharged, albeit with certain physical limitations, she insisted that Hannah refocus on her path. "You've done enough, daughter," she said softly. That daughter resonated deeply. She had never heard it sincerely in her hometown, but in that woman broken by illness, she found something worth more than any last name. That's how she returned to her studies with greater determination, this time with a full scholarship she earned on her own merit. Her story had spread throughout the school, and some teachers were determined to support her. Not out of pity, but out of respect. Hannah didn't ask for charity. She only asked for space to show who she was when she didn't have to bear the chains of a family that kept her subdued. In one of the final classes of the course, she was asked to give a presentation on human resource management. While preparing her presentation, she thought about everything she had experienced, how she had been treated as just another resource, like an unpaid domestic worker, like a shadow who cleaned, cooked, and remained silent. She decided then to tell her story, not with names or details that would directly expose her family, but with the emotional truth of what she had experienced. She spoke of unpaid work, of the psychological strain, of the burden many women carry, without anyone acknowledging it. When she finished, the room was silent. There was no effusive applause, no tears, only respect. Because everyone somehow knew this wasn't an academic exercise. It was a testimony. And she was brave. After that presentation, one of the teachers approached Hannah and said something that would define her. Sometimes, speaking the truth without hate is the most revolutionary thing you can do. It wasn't something she had planned. She never saw herself as someone strong enough to inspire others. But at that moment, She understood that her story wasn't just a wound, it could also be a tool. She began to write more. Short texts, reflections, experiences. She shared them on forums and social media under a pseudonym, not seeking fame or followers, but simply connection. And to her surprise, many people responded. Women who felt seen, young people who said, "I went through that too." Hannah wasn't looking for redemption. She was looking for reconstruction. And word for word, she was achieving both. It was in the midst of this newfound momentum that she received an unexpected message. Her mother. Not a call, but an email. The subject was, "Are you okay?" And the message simply read, "I still don't understand why you left like this, but the house isn't the same without you." Hannah read those lines many times, searching for some form of accountability, some sign of real change. But she didn't find it. It was more of a complaint than an apology. She didn't respond. Not out of resentment, but because she no longer needed to explain herself. For years, she had begged with gestures and silence to be seen, and no one did. Now that she was shining on her own, she wasn't going to turn off her light again so others could feel comfortable in the darkness. In the following months, Hannah graduated and landed her first formal job as an administrative assistant at a nonprofit. The pay was modest, but the environment was everything she'd dreamed of. Respect, collaboration, autonomy. For the first time, she felt her time was worth it, that every minute of effort had a purpose beyond surviving. She rented a new apartment, still small but brighter, with plants in the window and a bookshelf full of books she'd collected at secondhand markets. Every object she placed there was a symbol of something she had earned on her own, without favors, without sacrificing herself for the whims of others. That space, though simple, was the exact reflection of the life she was building. Free, dignified, and authentic. One Sunday afternoon, while she was cleaning the kitchen with soft music playing in the background, someone knocked on the door. It was Caleb. Thinner, disheveled, with an expression that mixed confusion and defeat. Hannah hadn't expected it, nor wanted it. He just said, "I don't know how we ended up like this." She didn't answer. She let him talk. He complained about how the house had become a mess, how his parents argued constantly, how difficult it was to have it all fall on him. There was a hint of nostalgia, but also selfishness. When he finished, Hannah took a deep breath and replied, "That's how I lived for years, only no one cared." There was no shouting, no dramatic closure, just a soft slam of the door as Caleb left. Because sometimes justice comes not with vengeance, but with clarity. And Hannah, in that moment, was clearer than ever. From that day on, she never heard from Caleb again, nor did she seek him out. Not because she hated him, but because she understood that there were people who weren't going to change simply because you changed. Hannah had stopped needing her brother to apologize to feel at peace. True reparation didn't come from outside. It came from every decision she made to live differently, to stop serving and start existing. In her new environment, people valued her for who she was, not for what she did for them. Amara was still by her side, faithful, present, and her adoptive mother, though physically frailer, was a warm presence who still hugged her every time she visited. It was a simple life, but for Hannah it was hers, and that changed everything. A year after that encounter with Caleb, Hannah was invited to speak at a local event on unpaid domestic work and gender roles. She hesitated to accept. Speaking in front of strangers about such an intimate story felt like exposing a wound that no longer bled, but still hurt if touched incorrectly. Still, she accepted. She took the stage with cold hands and a fast-beating heart, but her voice steady. She shared her story without embellishment or drama, with the same serenity with which she had lived it. The audience didn't burst into applause. They were silent for only a few seconds, and then, one by one, they began to stand up. It wasn't because of her, it was because of what her story stirred in others, a truth that many carried inside but no one dared to speak out loud. After that event, something changed. In the way Hannah saw herself. She was no longer just someone who had survived a dysfunctional family, but someone who had built a life of her own and, without intending to, had become a silent example of resilience. She began collaborating with organizations that supported young people experiencing domestic and emotional abuse. She didn't present herself as a victim, but as someone who understood what it was like to live for others without leaving room for oneself. Her experience wasn't a resume, but a compass. It became clear to everyone who heard her story that it was possible to get out, even if it meant walking without looking back, with a broken heart but firm steps. One autumn afternoon, while arranging files in her office, she found an envelope with no return address on her desk. Upon opening it, she recognized her mother's handwriting. It was a long, handwritten letter, in which, for the first time, she neither justified nor demanded. She said only that the house was empty, that her father had developed a heart condition, and that Caleb had moved away without a trace. She said she understood, that perhaps she had always understood but hadn't known how to act, and that if she ever wanted to talk, she would be there, unconditionally. Hannah read it all in silence, her eyes fixed and her chest tight. She didn't cry. She didn't respond. But she kept the letter in her box of things that matter, next to Amara's photo and the first text she'd ever written. Not because she forgave, but because, at least this time, she didn't feel invisible. A few days after putting the letter away, Hannah decided to do something she'd been putting off for a while. She walked past the house where she grew up again. She didn't go in. She just stood on the other side of the street, watching. The garden was no longer tended, the curtains always seemed closed, and the mailbox was full of papers. It was incredible to think that this place, which had once seemed the center of her world, now held so little emotion. There was no nostalgia, only distance. It was as if she were observing a scene from another life, one that no longer belonged to her. She walked back without looking back, feeling with each step the exact weight of what she no longer needed to carry. For the first time, she understood that she owed nothing, to no one. As time passed, her routine took on new forms. She no longer woke up with a start, nor did she avoid Sundays as she had before, when they were synonymous with family gatherings where she was treated like useful furniture. Now she used Sundays to read, to care for her plants, to write things she didn't show to anyone. Her apartment, though small, was warm. She had photos on the walls, a rug she'd chosen herself, and a kettle always full. Sometimes Amara would spend the afternoon with her. They spoke little but understood each other just by looking at each other. That peace she built didn't come suddenly, nor as a divine reward. It was the result of silent, consistent, often painful decisions, but her own. And that, for Hannah, was worth more than any belated forgiveness. In a casual conversation with a colleague, the idea of writing an article about unpaid domestic work for a local magazine came up. Hannah hesitated at first, as she always did when she had to re-examine her story. But then she thought about how many women were still trapped in roles that no one questioned, simply because no one talked about them. So she wrote, not from drama, but from truth. She accurately described what it was like to get up before everyone else to make breakfast, what it was like to clean without being noticed, what it was like to be useful without being wanted. The article was published under her real name for the first time, and when she saw it in print, on paper, with her byline at the end, she felt something she'd never felt before: pride in herself. Following that publication, she was invited to participate in more venues. Sometimes she spoke at schools, other times at community groups. She never sought the spotlight, and for that very reason, her words were more resonant. Her voice was calm, without rancor, but with a disarming clarity. People of all ages approached her afterward to thank her, to share similar stories, to say, "Thank you for putting it into words." And while each encounter stirred sensitive parts of her past, it also reinforced what she had achieved. Not only to break a cycle, but to name it. Because there are wounds that hurt more for not being spoken, for being trapped in shame. By sharing them, Hannah gave them form. And by giving them form, she also took away their power to continue hurting. One day, upon returning from work, she found a small box in her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a family photo album, clearly old, with images from her childhood she didn't remember ever seeing. At first, she thought it was a provocation, but as she scanned each page, she noticed something different. Small post-its with notes written in her mother's shaky handwriting. "That day you cooked alone for the first time. Here, you fixed your grandmother's dress. I never told you, but I always saw it." Hannah remained silent for a long time. She didn't cry, she didn't knock, she didn't answer. But for the first time, she felt that maybe someone was beginning to understand, even if it was late, even if it wouldn't change anything, even if it didn't hurt like it used. 2. The album didn't alter her path, but it did confirm something she'd been sensing. Not all stories need a reconciling ending to find closure. Hers didn't end with hugs or forgiveness, but with a new life she took it upon herself to build. And that was enough. She began teaching as a volunteer at a center for young women seeking independence. She spoke to them about rights, but also about dignity, about how, often, the first act of self-love is to stop justifying the unjustifiable. Some looked at her with distrust, others with tears in their eyes, but they all listened. And when Hannah spoke to them, she also spoke to herself, reminding herself that the freedom she had worked so hard to achieve deserved to be nurtured every day, because it had arrived alone, in silence, but here to stay. At 25, Hannah signed the lease for a small space she would transform into a community bookstore. It wasn't a get-rich-quick venture, but a space to share stories that didn't usually have a place. She placed a simple sign at the entrance. Here, voices that weren't heard before can be heard. On the walls, she hung quotes written by women who had passed through the center where she taught. Each donated book had a note on the back. This book was read freely. The place became a refuge for many, and for Hannah, it was confirmation that the initial solitude hadn't been in vain. Every step, every silence, every refusal to turn back had built that present. Hannah didn't return to the Whitmore house, not on special occasions, nor out of nostalgia. The memory of that place lived on in her, yes, but as a warning, not as a longing. Every time she turned the key to her bookcase or her apartment, she felt like she was closing another door to the past. Not out of hatred, not out of resentment, just out of self-respect. On an internet forum one day, someone posted, "What was the exact moment you decided to choose yourself?" And without giving it much thought, Hannah wrote, "When I left quietly and no one asked why." She closed her browser, poured herself a coffee, and returned to her desk. Outside, it was raining softly. Inside, there was peace. Because in the end, it wasn't the noise that set her free. It was the silence she chose, the one that didn't beg to be heard, only respected.